A very good afternoon to everybody, and I am going to keep my remarks very short for the express reason to build in enough time for some questions, because what we have learned about budgeting is, as school board members, that is the most important part of your role. You reflect your constituents. And your constituents are not necessarily the people who elected you. It's the kids, and to a lesser extent, the families in your community. So thank you for your service to your community. How many of you in this room, hands please, are school board members? And how many of you are currently working in administrative roles or support? Okay, thank you. We're not going to talk too much about strategic planning because we want to focus around budgeting. But one of the things that I would say to each of you is, if you don't have a strategic plan, that's probably okay, because I have a bias. Some of you in the room will know I have a bias about strategic planning. But you have to have a plan. And you have to have a plan that has metrics, and it has to be understandable. And here's the difference between a strategic plan and something that's called the capacity roadmap, is the strategic plan needs to change. It needs to be updated. And in theory, it's a 3 to 5 year plan with a mission, a vision, a bunch of stuff. Hopefully you've got a financial goal with real numbers that make sense, but it needs to be adjusted in real time to reflect the challenges that you as board members and leaders in your district are dealing with. Not going back over the course of a year, but rather getting directly to maybe quarterly adjustments in that plan. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today, around tools and a sense of work on how you understand that budget and can communicate that. So 3 things to focus your board around around a culture of improvement for the budget. 1, clear, simple metrics with all decisions made through the lens of financials and student learning. Or in the case of the organization I'm with, School Boards for Academic Excellence, better educational outcomes, because your decisions focus around better educational outcomes. 2, use common sense around your budget. Dollars in, expenditures. You want to end the year in the black, or at least with a balanced budget. And if you're using fund balance or your reserves, you need to understand you're starting to eat your seed corn. Doesn't mean you don't use your fund balance, but you don't use your fund balance for operations or to avoid difficult decisions. And 3, rather than constantly asking for more money, which is where a lot of the education establishment is asking for more money and more money, doesn't mean you shouldn't advocate for more money. I'm not saying all of you should be spending your time advocating for the money. Leave that to the paid lobbyists, because that's what they know how to do. Leave that to the associations, because they represent you. What you need to be thinking about is, how do we use the money that we've got? And I am somebody who is absolutely committed to public schools. I believe that parent power is here to stay. And I also believe that we are right on the threshold, which is why I thanked you for your service at the beginning. We are right on the threshold of huge transformations in what schools are going to look like. And so the budget will be driving that. And you need to be making decisions around budget, not just year to year, which a lot of the people want you to make those decisions. You're the stewards. Your constituency are the kids and families, not the people who elected you. That's part of the reason there's a whole lot of discussion around board superintendent relationships, board superintendent troubles. Are we doing slides?
Oh, it's up there if you want to use them.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I should have told you that ahead of time.
Sorry. So I'm just going to say one thing. Kim Amidzik from the Greendale Schools is here. You need to take a look at what your levels of authority are and your how your decisions are being made. We won't spend too much time on that. The thing around budgeting process and systems, we'll leave that to John. What I'll leave you with is this. You really need to understand what your budget is. You need to think in dollars in, expenditures out. You're going to have to deal with parent staffing or faculty staffing because in declining enrollment is here to stay for just about every one of you. And you do not have to do everything as it's been done before. I'll turn it over to John.
So I've done a lot of crazy things in my life, Iron Man with my water bottle being one of them, but I have this irrational fear of heights. And I've fallen off a stage twice in my life, so I don't like being up above it. And I found that this works better when there's engagement throughout that, because I have a couple colleagues in the room, and as Dr. Wiese and Dr. Plum know from Kettle Moraine and Board Member Richards, I can talk forever. So if there's something I say that you have a question on, please raise your hand or interject right away. I think it'll make part of this better. Couple quick things just to start the conversation. Two expressions come to mind. The first, if you walk into my pastor's office at St. Charles in Heartland, there's a nice 8x11 sign on the door that says, "Clear is kind." I think sometimes we spend a lot of time avoiding the difficult conversations, and as a result, we don't have the capacity maybe to give an important topic the due diligence it needs. The second, I will tell you from the perspective of a practitioner, and I've been doing this for 20 years now. It's crazy to think it's already been 20, but I can't recall a time in public finance for public education where there's ever been more pressure on business managers to tell people what they want to hear versus the reality. And because of declining enrollment, because of funding in some ways that hasn't kept up with inflation, people are always asking for more resources and don't want to make some tough decisions. But the reality is society is changing. I don't know what was covered this morning, but I'm guessing you probably saw some statewide graphics around the birth rate and projected decreases in enrollment across the next 7 to 10 years. We are all going to have to make some tough decisions. And as Dr. Hughes just said, it's important that that's through the lens of student learning. But before you can make good decisions, you have to know what your baseline is and what benchmarks you can utilize to figure out how are you taking care of your core foundation. So a couple themes that an hour from now I hope you can pull from this. So the first, my wife learns every day just how good at math I am, but how unhandy I am around the house. I know very, very little about some of the technical aspects. So when I'm meeting with our facilities director and technology director and food service director, it's crucial that I ask the right questions to be able to get the answers and the background I need from them. Similarly, for school board members, if you're a board member that doesn't have a background in educational finance, Dr. Flanders just mentioned before, it's a very complex, in many ways by design, system. You need to know what questions to ask to make sure that you're getting the information that you need to execute your fiduciary responsibility. Timing. Within school districts, I was meeting with someone in the community yesterday who works in municipal finance, and their question to me was, how do you make good decisions when you're not finalizing and setting your budget until 4 months into your financial year? I don't know that there's a good way kind of around that, but it requires a good long-term 12-month process. So you're not trying to make decisions in September, October when you get your student count and you've already locked teacher contracts and other staffing 6 months earlier. The third, capital planning. I'll probably just touch on this a couple times today, but if you look at longitudinal data from the Department of Public Instruction, and state taxes, I believe, are about $6.5 billion. Roughly one out of every $6 currently levied for school property taxes in Wisconsin is for debt. And Fund 39 is something separate, is approved by your voters for capital projects. But as we're finding out right now, as we're having a lot of discussion around the state about property taxes, if you're levying $1 for debt, that's a dollar you can't ask for or utilize for operations. And then fourth, enrollment. When Dr. Plum came to, well, he was at Kettle Moraine, but when he became superintendent in April of 2021, I was camped out, maybe staging a sit-in in his office saying, Steve, the first thing we're going to talk about is enrollment and sustainability. In some districts, this might be something that you're looking at once or twice a year in the fall when the third Friday count is being reported. Maybe you get a 5-year projection from your local school district. But given how closely aligned enrollment is with money, that needs to be something that you're constantly keeping at front of mind, because if enrollment changes, you're going to feel an impact almost immediately. So to start, do we have? Okay. I also sometimes fail to follow my own slide deck, so sorry about that. Something I inherited and have tried to enhance within Kettle Moraine, we call this our key measures of fiscal health. So we had the unfortunate experience last spring of making the difficult decision to close an elementary school. And there's a lot of emotion involved in that when you have a school that's been open for, I think in McGee's case, 100 years in different formats, and you're restructuring. Well, people bring an emotional response, and the first piece of that is usually, we didn't know about this, we weren't informed, what's the data that's being utilized to make that decision? At Kettle Moraine, in a given year, there are typically 40 different presentations or reports provided to the school board around fiscal policy or fiscal measures. So it isn't something that comes up once a year during the annual meeting, when you're adopting the tax levy, when you're setting the preliminary budget. We don't want that to be the focus of every school board meeting, because we're here to talk about student learning. That's the focus. But there's information in the background, hopefully empowering Ms. Richards and our other board members to say, John, your report says that we're in a good position. How do we know? What data are we comparing against? What did this look like in previous years? The goal of that is, for that first point, to empower you to ask right questions. Something doesn't look right. This doesn't make sense to me. I have a rule. I like to think I'm an optimist in life, but I'm always suspicious of good news. It's always, is this true or is this taken out of context? And if you think about school district budgets, some pieces of operations might be 1/12 each month, and there's a lot of things that happen once per year. So if you're looking at things just on a simple straight line projection basis, it's pretty easy to think things are fine. Either you're way ahead on revenue, you're way ahead on expenses without accounting for when things happen during the year. So not saying that your school district, your business manager in your district might be very angry that I told you you should expect 40 reports. But the more information you have out there, it helps have those different measures and benchmarks throughout the course of time to make sure that things are on a good alignment. I guess the second piece I wanted to cover was what I call the 7 safeguards. So there are, within our budget, I want to say 40,000 different budget lines. There are realistically 8 to 10 that will either make or break our financial year. So coding and getting it right is important, but there are some things, Kettle Moraine has a budget of about $60 million. for most board meetings, it doesn't pay to focus on 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000. I really love my board, although sometimes they do focus on a few of those things. Sorry, Amy. But from the perspective of what you're looking at and what you should spend your time tracking on, salaries. So I look at what we put on board docs and we put out as two purposes. One, I want the board to know. Two, I want to have a historical record that is easy for us to come back on. And three, if there's a change. If your district is running into financial distress or turbulence, I can all but guarantee it's the result of staffing that wasn't planned. And we're all working really hard to try to serve all students, students that sometimes have unique needs. But if I think back to 4 or 5 years ago when the federal government was pumping a huge amount of money into public schools across the country to help us navigate COVID and some of the aftermath, one of the first things that most school boards, most administrations probably talked about was, this is temporary money, this is one-time money. What are we gonna do and what's our plan for when the money runs out? There were some state policy decisions made in terms of ongoing funding and per pupil revenue. But if I look back 5 or 6 years from now and we're having discussions around some of the staffing levels around the state, there are likely positions that districts are maintaining, right or wrong, that 5, 6 years ago when they were created were never intended to be permanent. And as a part of that, we have to make key decisions. So Dr. Wiesa, who's our chief of HR, and I put together a couple reports throughout the year where we let the board and the community know, here are the number of FTEs we have now, here's what we had last year, usually it's a 5-year trend, and the goal of that is if there is a new position that's being created within the district, Dr. Plum, Dr. Wiesa, and myself should be prepared to speak to the why. And in most cases from a financial basis, since we know our enrollment isn't going up and our funding's not going up, if we're adding something, if it's important to kids, we have to figure out from a prioritization standpoint what expense or what position is not as effective or important to make sure that we have the resources to sustain that. Second, health insurance. Over the last 5 years, this is our district's 5th year with self-insurance. If I had to guess, I would say we probably moved from a place where 2/3 to 3/4 of the state were fully insured a decade ago, and I would say that's flipped now with some of the tools and technology that's available, and the health insurance market is changing. There's been a couple big carriers that have gotten out of the marketplace. We at Trust, Humana, and others, that they don't want the risk anymore. They want to transfer that risk locally, so they just administer expenses. Well, from health insurance, depending on what your plan year is, and it might be starting in January, might be starting in July, some even have it September, there are different things that happen throughout the year that are not on a linear basis. Keeping a hold of what those assumptions are and how you're accounting for that and how you're protecting yourself is very important. If you have a financial deficit in the spring you weren't expecting and it's not related to staff, the second most likely culprit is probably health insurance. So I think the key is whether it be what, and I won't bore you with the jargon, but where your stop loss insurance kicks in, where your aggregate kicks in, those are different things that the board will want to take an active role on. When I get questions from our board members, I don't find it offensive or they're questioning me, well, can you talk a little bit more about this? I look at it as engagement, that they care, and if we have to present a change to them, that they're educated and have the understanding to be able to support that decision. Third, technology. So this is one I used to have my autopilot on, I'll just say, because inflation was pretty low overall in the 2010s. We didn't spend a lot of dollars, and each year that went by, there was more competition, and you could get a better deal for technology. Well, I'd say the last 3 to 5 years, that's completely changed. I guess there's 3 things from a technology perspective. One, the cost with the conflict in the Middle East right now. I know we've seen some prices on things go up 20 to 30% within weeks. So from a timing standpoint, if you know exactly what you're going to be doing for the upcoming year, The earlier you're prepared as a board or administration to make that decision, you can lock in and have that cost certainty. The second piece is we have a process that has a couple different names in our district, but I like to call it the change to the status quo. When something is going to require ongoing support, and that could be support from the tech team, it could be a replacement cycle that's going to happen every 2, 3 to 5 years. There needs to be a question that goes beyond what is the acquisition cost of this new technology, but how does this impact our infrastructure moving forward? A lot of times you bring something in and it's a great tool. The worst programs are the ones that you bring in, they're popular, and then you find out you can't afford them. And then you're in a position of taking something away from a constituency that had that. But in general, we make a heavy use of our prepaid technology account, and we also have a rolling 10-year plan that includes all facility maintenance and technology upgrades within the district. We're trying to find a way to incorporate some of our curriculum adoption cycle into that as well. But the idea being that if you look at a school budget, it looks very large until you look at all the different commitments you've already made. And by having some of those core infrastructure pieces included right from the start, there won't be a surprise that'll force you to go to referendum, or you won't be left in a position where you don't have the resources to fund your most critical needs. Fourth, curriculum and instruction. We've had a sea change from my perspective as the business guy within our district the last 5 years. We've moved back towards more traditional curriculum cycles. Well, that's been quite expensive, and there's some pretty significant variance. It's a 6-year cycle, but I can tell you over the course of the 6 years, whenever literacy comes up, it's going to be probably half of your 6-year budget. Math is probably another like third or quarter. So that's pretty difficult to fund in a specific year when you have that level of variability. But if you can look at that as far as a 6-year cycle and the years when you don't have some of the more expensive subjects to implement, if you can be setting aside money, we use Fund 41 or Fund 46 to do that, then when the more expensive aspects of that cycle come up, you're prepared for it, rather than explaining a deficit to your public or trying to figure out how do you get those critical resources that you need for students. Facilities. So we are doing something a little crazy at KM, and I'm pretty sure it's going to work. I'm hoping it's going to work, but most districts are going to the left, we're going to the right. We have about 4 years to go for our capital debt payment, and then Kettle Moraine will be completely debt-free. I'm 44, I plan to be at Kettle Moraine for 18 more years. My goal is to never go for a capital referendum ever again. And there's 2 reasons for that. Well, 3. 1, I just don't like the concept of debt in general. But 2, we know we're going to need operational resources. I would say my single best role in this is to protect resources for student learning. For me, that usually means protecting resources to ensure that we can attract and retain high-quality teachers. Well, in my mind, having done this for 20 years, the biggest competition for that would be a school community that wants to continually build bigger and better facilities. I think a few of my friends are going out for capital referendum this year, and I've heard numbers like $600 or $650 per square foot thrown around. That's a ton of money and will take decades to repay. And when you make that commitment for capital debt, it's not a commitment for the next budget cycle. In most cases, it's a commitment for the next 20 years. So if once you've made that decision, that's not something that a successor school board or someone else can come in and outdo. So to prepare for that, and our board actually had this idea maybe 5 years before I got to Kettle Moraine, but when we passed a capital referendum in 2015, the board at the time had said, we don't want to do this again. Administration, figure it out. So what we've done with our Fund 41 and Fund 46 is try to methodically set aside money each and every year into that fund. So when we have needs that come, and right now I can tell you our budgeted maintenance capital infrastructure needs is about $35 million over the next decade, we need to be intentional at setting dollars aside. When that debt falls off 4 or 5 years from now, I'm hoping we'll be positioned to pass an operational referendum that's tax neutral, that allows us to sustain and continue that process. But having been through, again, a number of projects over the course of my career, if you're building a brand new school, it doesn't make sense to do it in 10, 15, 20 different pieces. However, if you're doing other projects and I don't know how many of you might have been on a building and grounds committee, but you're making some of those decisions around the last 5, 10, 15% of whatever your referendum amount of money is. If you pass a capital referendum and you issue debt, you have a very defined time period by which you must spend the money, or it goes back to fund the prepay of the debt. If you are funding your facilities and maintenance with operational resources and you are able to save money, like this spring before the Iran conflict, we just locked contracts to redo some parking lots at cost probably 40% below what it has been the last 5 years. Well, that money, because it's operational money, we can now put back into learning, or we can bank for a future expense. If it's part of a capital project funded by capital debt, we have to spend that under the items listed for that debt question. But facilities, again, it's important. You need to have safe, clean, practical facilities for your kids to learn in, but every dollar of expansion, of enhancement you spend is a dollar that competes with your educational mission. I could go on for 2 hours, so I'm gonna skip past utilities and capital improvements for the moment. So staffing. One of the most challenging aspects, I think, of being a school business manager is, for better or for worse, you have a lot of power and influence because you control the narrative in many cases about what is presented to the school board. Now, that said, that's a lot of pressure. You don't want one individual making decisions, you want a team. We have a collaborative administrative team that's involved in the budget development process at Kettle Moraine, and we've also created what we call our Budget Advisory Council. This is a group of, and I think, shoot, I just forgot his name, young man that was with Lieutenant Governor Clayfish outside, had said, Ben, sorry, thank you, Bill. We have about 40 active members of our community, some retired folks, some parents, some former staff, some business owners that for some reason come and want to talk to me for 2 or 3 hours, 2 or 3 times a year. And Steve always likes to tell a joke as an icebreaker. He's like, you people, you keep coming back. I don't understand, but you do. And the goal of that committee is to get critical feedback throughout the process, to test our assumptions, to help us find our blind spots. There's so many different things within school leadership where there isn't an absolute right or wrong, especially when it comes to dollars. But if we're trying to decide how we balance funding for intervention and literacy versus special education versus safety versus athletics, we want to get that right. And to do that, we have this group of people in the community that are empowered to provide us that feedback, to give us a different lens from the school board. So if what we're doing is not in alignment with our community, we want to know that before we have an adopted budget. One of the worst things I can think of for a senior school administrator is to have a proposal that you've put a lot of time and effort into, that's very timely, you bring it to the school board, and it gets rejected, and you had no idea that rejection was coming. The goal is to have intervention before it gets to the place where you only bring something to the board where it's a last or formality step. And to do that, you need to make sure you're in alignment with your community. Now, the secondary piece of that, from a making decisions with data perspective, is some of these choices are hard. We have a local discussion in our community right now around student services. What's the appropriate level for school counselors, for psychologists, for social workers? Serving the mental health needs of our kids is really important. But there isn't necessarily an absolute objective right or wrong in terms of what that staffing level should be. So when we have some of these conversations with the Budget Advisory Council, it helps us, helps inform that perspective. So when we do make a difficult decision or we ask the board to support a difficult decision, it's vetted and there's data behind that. I guess the last piece I want to say about enrollment, and then I want to make time for questions for either Dr. Hughes or myself. So enrollment, there's this, I guess not new anymore, technology through Excel, or I came to CAM and I started using Google Docs. Apparently there's a program called SharePoint through Microsoft Excel. You get all the functionality of Excel, but the same accessibility and shareability of Google Docs. The district registrar and I communicate probably 2 to 3 times a week, every week from February through September when the third Friday count is done. So at CAM, when I came to CAM in 2019, we had already been declining in enrollment for about 10 years, but it was a pretty steady gradual decline. Our enrollment projection that we'd present to the board once per year was generally in October, and it was based on a 5-year cohort survival model. What I didn't know at the time, because we didn't have enough longitudinal data put together, was we had an outlier year in the 2016-17 year that was influencing that 5-year data set. And there were no benchmarks or measures throughout the year that made me question whether or not there was going to be an outlier. As a result, the first 5 budgets I presented in the spring to Kettle Moraine all badly overestimated the amount of enrollment we would have. And luckily, under Wisconsin school finance, you get a declining enrollment exemption. So for 1 year, you're held harmless. But in many cases, all that does is prolong or push out a difficult decision to be made a year later. So what we've done from a benchmark perspective is, beginning with the end of February, when some of our enrollment data is rolled, we now have 5 years of data that we benchmark against that same number by building, by grade level, by area, with 5 years of data. So at the end of February, at the end of March, the end of April, if something looks good, well, is it based on the same point and the same data throughout the year? And I think that's given us a lot of confidence in terms of how we're making decisions around staffing, how we're planning for the number of kids that can be in each building. And when we get to September, when that count is done on third Friday and that's presented to the board the first week of October, it's not a surprise. And that's important for us in our district. Many of you are probably aware that the non-renewal deadline for teaching staff is next week. So after April 30th, you no longer have the ability to adjust your teaching FTE unless someone voluntarily resigns. We wanted to have enough enrollment data and enough trend data. As I would say, 2 or 3 data points does not make a trend. You ideally want 10, 12, 15. Starting that process earlier is helpful. Last comment on budget cycles. So business officials are generally working in 3 budget years at any given time. So right now, well, I guess we're a little bit past the audit piece, but in the fall, you're generally closing the books and finalizing the audit from the previous year. You're administering your current year plan, and you're starting your plan for next year. We do our first budget projections for the next year basis in November. The board gets an updated 5-year rolling average report in January or February. We bring our preliminary budget to the board in April or May, have our annual meeting in June, and then set the final budget in October. So that creates 5 deliberate, distinctive points where, if there are key decisions coming, that the board can expect and will engage with us on those decisions. And it helps us, again, address and identify those crucial things far enough in advance where we still have time to study and research, or in some cases to build local political understanding for why decisions are necessary. Yeah. Sure, absolutely.
One of the things that I would really encourage you to think about around staffing is rethinking the staffing model. One teacher, one classroom. The staffing model that is in place with the next generation education workforce, which is based out of Arizona State University, is using a variation of what some of you might have experienced along the way in your own education, team teaching. And so to think about it as so to oversimplify it, 4 fourth grade teachers, a master teacher who is truly a master of his or her craft and who really understands how to teach fourth graders, who also, by the way, takes responsibility for all the lesson planning and troubleshoots kids' learning. So in a group of 100, 110 group of children, that person oversees the education of that fourth grade. And then there's a teacher or two who are your solid fourth grade teachers. And they're following the direction of the master teacher. They're following the lesson plans on what that looks like. They're compensated differently. They have less responsibility because the master teacher is overseeing it. And then you have an intern or what some of you might think of as a student teacher who gets paid $15,000 a semester, who is supervised by the lead teacher, who is linked to a university or a teacher placement program. And that person slides, if you're in a growing enrollment situation, that person slides into a job in the school. It's really a charter school model that's been in place for about 15 to 20 years, and it's just a different way to think about it. And so I would encourage you to look at the ASU Next Generation Education Workforce. After the presentation, we can talk about it. Second thing I'd encourage you to think about is based on, and if you're not looking at Edunomics, which is out of Georgetown, Marguerite Rosa, who was a presenter 2 years ago at this summit, she really takes a look at how to think differently about staffing and compensation. And so one simple solution, which is not going to be met well by a lot of traditional public school educators, is you don't lay off the newest teachers, you build in the entire performance and contribution of that person. And what Marguerite would say is, well, of course the union and the people are going to come in and raise holy heck with you about that. But at the end of the day, if it's in your master contract, you probably have to adhere to it, but you also could get that out of the contract. And it also might be worth having the conversation in the staffing discussions about where does the total contribution of the individual fit within the district or the organization versus we're just going to let go the newest people who we're building around. Last thing I would say is there's another place where you can actually look, and that is you start to look at health insurance benefits. There's a number of research studies out there that most teachers are more concerned about salary because that's what's pressing down on them in today's world. The union and much of the establishment is about the total compensation package, and your business manager or your business officials have to think about that all the time. But at the end of the day, most people need more money in their pocket. And so to be able to at least have that conversation, like maybe we start to bird walk away from dental insurance. Maybe we shift what the carriers look like into self-insured. And you're going to get pushback on that. But the decline in enrollment situations that you're facing is the challenge you have around the revenue. Even if you get an increase for a year or two, the declining enrollment situation is the driver of a funding formula that is built for growth, not decline. And so you actually have to be thinking about, like I said, how do you spend the money? How are you spending the money that you have versus the money that you want?
Thanks to both of you there. It's and I'll mention the economic stuff. Most of it is available for free, so you can go look up a lot of this data without any cost.